You ever get the cops called on you for fixing your own dock, not trespassing, not blasting music, just tightening a loose board with a wrench and boom, flashing lights, gun holster, full show. One lady from the HOA said I was illegally occupying shared property. Shared with who? The ducks. Then her little clipboard soldier popped out from the trees, filming me like I was burying a body. I stood there thinking, is this real life or a parody of suburban madness? Trust me, it spirals fast from there. Ever had someone try to rewrite your entire history over a property line? Let me know in comments below. My name's Clark, and I'm 50 years old. Well, I was 50 when this story took place. I've got what you might call a thin build, but my late wife always said I had sharp eyes that could spot trouble from a mile away. Maybe that's why I used to work as a property consultant, reading contracts down to the last line, and making sure people didn't get screwed over by fine print. These days, though, I just wanted to fish and read books in peace by the lake. That's it. Simple life, simple goals. I figured I'd earn some quiet time after decades of dealing with other people's property disputes. Looking back, I should have known that peace never lasts long when there are people like Francine Vaughn around. Francine Vaughn, the HOA president, wore power like perfume. She had this expression. I don't know how else to describe it, except that she always looked like the whole world owed her something. And maybe that's exactly how she saw things, because from the moment I moved to this lakeside community, she made it clear that my independence was somehow a personal insult to her authority. I'm not even sure why she targeted me specifically at first. Maybe it was because I didn't show up to every HOA meeting with a notepad and an eager, please smile like some of the other residents. At first, the harassment was just small stuff. You know, those passive-aggressive reminders that make you wonder if you're being paranoid, or if someone really is out to get you. Your grass is getting a little long, Clark. Your dog seems to be barking quite a bit lately. Maybe you could park your truck a little straighter in your driveway. I'd get these little yellow sticky notes on my mailbox about once a week, always signed with her perfect cursive signature. I shrugged most of it off, figured they'd get bored and move on to bothering someone else. I mean, come on. My grass was maybe an inch longer than regulation, and my dog barely barked unless someone was actually walking up to the house. But Francine acted like I was running some kind of junkyard operation in the middle of Beverly Hills. But then she targeted the dock, the same dock my father built in 1960, 5 with lumber hauled from the mountains. A few aging planks and old bolts, but it held 60 years of memories. I'd learned to fish on that dock, proposed to my late wife on that dock, and spent countless summer evenings watching the sunset paint the water gold. That dock was probably the only thing left that truly connected me to my dad, who'd passed away 10 years earlier. And Francine knew it because I'd told her the story once when she first moved to the neighborhood and seemed almost human. The warning letters started pouring in like confetti at a parade. Official HOA letterhead, certified mail, the whole 9 yards. Dock not meeting community standards. Structure ruining neighborhood aesthetics. Immediate removal required to maintain property values. I'd sit at my kitchen table reading these things and just shake my head. Something about her tone made my skin crawl. It wasn't just bureaucratic, it was vindictive. The breaking point came on a sunny afternoon when I was fixing some loose boards on my dock. I'd noticed them wobbling the day before, and being the type of guy who fixes problems instead of ignoring them, I was out there with my toolbox trying to tighten everything up. That's when I caught an HOA security guard hiding behind the trees, taking photos of me with his phone. I'm talking full, on surveillance mode, crouched down trying to stay hidden, like he was documenting some kind of criminal activity. When he saw me watching him, he jumped like I'd fired a gun, dropped his phone right into the pine needles, and scrambled away like a kid caught stealing cookies from the jar. I just stood there holding my hammer, watching this grown man sprint toward the parking lot, and I couldn't help but smirk. Ah, so that's how we're playing this game now. But here's the thing that bothered me most. His expression wasn't just someone following orders from his boss. There was something personal in his eyes, almost vindictive, like he had some kind of grudge against me, too. Maybe Francine had been filling everyone's heads with stories about what a terrible neighbor I was. Maybe she'd convinced them all that I was some kind of threat to their peaceful community. I don't know, but that look in his eyes told me this was about to get a lot worse before it got better. That evening, I found myself digging through Dad's old property papers, looking for anything that might help me understand what I was dealing with. Most of it was standard stuff, deeds, tax records, survey maps from decades ago. But there was this one survey map that caught my attention, showing my dock sitting completely outside the HOA boundaries. There was also something about leased land that I couldn't quite piece together yet, but it seemed important. I spread all the papers out on my dining room table and tried to make sense of the legal jargon, but honestly, I felt like I was missing something crucial, something that could either save me or destroy me, and I had no idea which. I suddenly realized I might not be the victim here after all. Maybe, just maybe, I was holding the key to turning this whole situation around. But was this my way out, or was I missing something dangerous that could backfire spectacularly? I honestly had no idea. But I knew I couldn't just sit there and let Francine steamroll over my family's history. The question was, did I have the guts to fight back? And more importantly, did I have the brains to win? 3 days later, the HOA sent their final ultimatum, a certified letter demanding dock removal in 7 days, or they'd pursue all available legal remedies. I read that letter twice, and instead of feeling scared or defeated, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt like the old me, the property consultant who never backed down from a fight when the law was on his side. So, instead of replying to their pompous certified letter, I picked up the phone and did something that probably seemed completely insane to anyone watching. I politely invited the entire HOA board to my house for coffee and a friendly discussion about the situation. Francine's voice on the phone was something else. You could practically hear her smirking through the receiver. She thought I was scared and ready to beg for mercy, maybe offer some kind of compromise that would let her claim victory while allowing me to keep a smaller dock or something. "Of course, Clark," she said in this syrupy, sweet tone that made my teeth hurt. "We'd be happy to discuss this matter in person. I think you'll find we're very reasonable people when approached with the right attitude." Right attitude, I had to bite my tongue to keep from laughing out loud. Did she really think I was calling to surrender? The meeting in my living room was like watching a bad community theater performance. She sat like a judge preparing to deliver a sentence, flanked by 2 other board members who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else on earth. Every few minutes, she'd glance at her watch, like she was timing how long it would take to demolish my resolve. I just sat there sipping my coffee, watching her performance with quiet amusement, letting her dig her own hole deeper with every word that came out of her mouth. Francine launched into a speech filled with HOA jargon and setting precedents for future enforcement actions. Big words, official, sounding phrases, the kind of language people use when they want to sound important and intimidating. But here's the thing about working in property law for 20 years. You learn to see through the fancy vocabulary and get to the real meaning underneath. And what Francine was really saying was, "I don't like you. I don't like your dock. And I'm going to use my position to make your life miserable until you do what I want." She just dressed it up in bureaucratic nonsense to make herself feel justified. The 2 other board members were so forgettable, I can't even remember their names. They just nodded along like bobblehead dolls every time Francine paused for breath. Absolutely right, Francine. That's exactly the issue we're facing. Community unity is so important. I wanted to ask them if they'd actually read the HOA charter, or if they just showed up to meetings to eat free donuts and feel important, but I kept my mouth shut and let Francine continue her performance. Sometimes the best strategy is to let your opponent talk themselves into a corner, and these 2 were helping her dig that hole deeper with every mindless agreement. Then she pulled out what she obviously thought was her trump card, a folder full of complaints from concerned neighbors about my dock. She spread them out on my coffee table like she was playing poker and showing a royal flush. Eyesore, safety hazard, doesn't fit community aesthetic. Page after page of typed complaints, all very official, looking all demanding immediate action. I leaned forward to get a better look, and that's when I noticed something interesting. Every single complaint was typed on the same computer using the same font with the same formatting. Even the signatures looked suspiciously similar when you examined them closely. "Francine," I said, slowly setting down my coffee cup, "these complaints, they all seem to come from the same source, almost like one person wrote them all and just changed the names." Her face went red faster than a stoplight, and she started shuffling the papers back into her folder like her life depended on it. That's completely irrelevant. The concerns are legitimate regardless of how they were documented. That's when I knew for certain that I wasn't dealing with someone who was just overzealous about community standards. I was dealing with someone who was willing to fabricate evidence to get what she wanted. The room went quiet for a long moment, and I could feel the tension building like pressure in a steam engine. The other board members were suddenly very interested in studying their shoes, and Francine was gripping her folder so tight her knuckles were white. That's when I decided to drop my own little bombshell, not the big one I was saving for later, but just enough to let her know that I wasn't the pushover she thought she was dealing with. "Mrs. Vaughn," I said in my calmest voice, "do you know how long this dock has existed?" I lifted a photo of my father fishing on that very dock, proof the dock was older than the HOA itself. Back then, this whole area was wilderness. No houses, no roads, and definitely no HOA. Just my dad, his dock, and all the fish he could catch. This dock was built before most of the houses in this neighborhood even existed. It was here before the HOA was formed, before most of these property lines were even surveyed. Francine's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no sound came out. I could see her brain working frantically, trying to come up with some response that would salvage her authority and justify her position. That doesn't matter," she finally managed to stammer out. "Current regulations apply to all structures, regardless of when they were built. Grandfathering clauses don't apply in cases where community safety and aesthetics are at stake." I had to admire her determination, even if she was doubling down on a losing hand. She was committed to playing it out to the bitter end. "Mrs. Vaughn," I said, looking straight into her eyes, "I think you might want to double check your understanding of property law before you make threats you can't back up." As Francine and her little entourage shuffled out of my house, still muttering about taking further action and consulting with legal counsel, I caught something in her expression that made my blood run cold. Her eyes burned with something colder than anger. She wasn't done. I locked my door behind them and realized I was probably about to find out just how far Francine Vaughn was willing to go to win this fight. I should have known that embarrassing Francine in front of her board members would just make her more determined to destroy me, but honestly, I didn't think she'd be stupid enough to try some of the stunts she pulled next. Looking back, I probably underestimated just how far a person will go when their ego gets bruised and they have a little bit of power to abuse. I woke to a full-blown hazmat crew blocking my driveway under HOA emergency orders. The foreman handed me stamped HOA nonsense about contaminated soil, while fish jumped in the clear lake behind him. I stood there in my bathrobe reading this ridiculous document, then looked out at the crystal, clear lake where fish were literally jumping in the morning sunlight, creating perfect ripples across the surface. "Environmental contamination?" I asked, gesturing toward the pristine water. "What exactly are we talking about here? Are the ducks too happy? Is the water too clean?" My deadpan delivery must have hit home because several crew members started exchanging uncomfortable glances and shuffling their feet, like they suddenly realized they were part of something that didn't make much sense. The foreman cleared his throat and tried to maintain his official demeanor, but I could see doubt creeping into his eyes as he looked around at the obviously healthy ecosystem surrounding my dock. Sir, the work order specifies contaminated soil and potential water pollution that requires immediate remediation." And he showed me the paperwork again, but now he was reading it more carefully, himself probably noticing for the first time that none of the specific details matched what he was seeing with his own eyes. After about 10 minutes of awkward conversation and a lot of confused looks between crew members, they packed up their equipment and left without cleaning anything. I watched their trucks disappear down the road and couldn't help but wonder what kind of bill Francine was going to get for that little performance. But that was just the warm-up act. 2 days later, I came home from grocery shopping to find my power and water had been cut off. No notice, no explanation, just suddenly living like it was 1850. I watched from my kitchen window as an electrician quickly disconnected my service, then practically sprinted to his truck when he spotted me watching through the glass. The guy moved so fast you'd think I was pointing a rifle at him, instead of just standing there holding a bag of groceries and wondering what the hell was happening to my quiet little life. Later, I found out Francine had hired some expensive lawyer to threaten the utility companies with legal action if they didn't cooperate with her harassment campaign. Dinner was a cold sandwich, eaten by candlelight like it was 1850. I seriously considered just packing up and moving somewhere peaceful. At my age, why start a war over a piece of wood and some family memories? I'd already lost my wife 2 years earlier to cancer. Did I really need more stress and conflict in my life? Maybe Francine was right. Maybe I should just find a nice retirement community somewhere in Florida where the biggest drama was arguing over shuffleboard rules. I could sell the house, take my memories of Dad and the dock, and start fresh somewhere else where nobody cared about property lines or community standards. But then I heard my father's voice in my head as clear as if he was sitting right there in the kitchen with me. Son, never let bullies win. They'll just find their next victim. Dad had faced down his share of bullies over the years. Crooked contractors, dishonest business partners, HOA presidents who thought their little bit of power made them untouchable. He always said that backing down from a bully doesn't buy you peace. It just teaches them that intimidation works, and they'll use the same tactics on the next person who can't or won't fight back. That's when I made my decision to stop playing defense and start doing some research of my own. I pulled out my phone flashlight and wrote my first battle plan note on the back of an envelope. Research HOA's public land lease agreements. And then I called my old buddy Russell, who specialized in municipal land law and owed me a favor from a case I'd helped him with 5 years earlier. Russell was one of those guys who genuinely enjoyed digging through legal documents looking for loopholes and technicalities. The kind of lawyer who got excited about finding obscure clauses that could turn an entire case upside down. Clark, Russell's voice boomed through the phone like he was genuinely happy to hear from me. How's retirement treating you? Still catching those monster bass off your famous dock? I explained the situation to him, trying to keep the anger out of my voice and just stick to the facts. Harassment campaign, fake environmental emergency utilities shut off without cause, the whole sad story. Russell listened without interrupting, and I could practically hear him taking notes on the other end of the line. When I finished, there was a moment of silence. Then Russell laughed loud and long. Clark, you beautiful genius, he said. Do you realize what you might be sitting on here? Do you understand that HOAs typically lease their common areas from the city or county, and those leases usually have penalty clauses for violations, plus adjustment mechanisms for special circumstances. I nearly dropped the phone. All those years of working property law, and I'd never thought to look at the HOA's relationship with the municipality from that angle. You mean, I started to ask, but Russell was already way ahead of me. I mean, you might be holding the nuclear option and not even know it. If your HOA is harassing residents and abusing their authority, there could be legal mechanisms in place that would let you, let's say, adjust their operating costs significantly. I hung up with Russell's words echoing in my head, but as I stared at those intimidating legal documents by flashlight, one thought kept nagging at me. What if I was about to start a war I couldn't win? I wasn't sure if I was being smart or stupid, but I knew I couldn't just sit there in the dark and let her steamroll over my family's history. The question was, did I have the guts to pull the trigger on whatever legal weapon Russell thought I might be holding? The morning of reckoning came exactly 1 week after my conversation with Russell, and I swear I've never been more nervous and more confident at the same time in my entire life. I was peacefully fishing off my dock coffee steaming in the cool morning air when police sirens shattered the silence like gunshots. 2 patrol cars pulled up to my house, followed immediately by Francine's white SUV. She climbed out of her vehicle like she was making a grand entrance at a movie premiere, practically glowing with anticipated victory, standing behind the officers like she was directing the whole show. Officer Miller, a decent-looking guy in his 30s with tired eyes that suggested he'd dealt with more than his share of neighborhood disputes, approached my dock cautiously. I could tell from his body language that he wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation, but he was trying to do his job professionally. Mr. Clark, he called out, his voice carrying that careful tone cops use when they're not sure if they're dealing with a dangerous criminal or just another petty neighborhood squabble. We received a complaint from the HOA about illegal occupation of community property and disturbing the peace. I set down my fishing rod and smiled, keeping my hands steady, even though my heart was sprinting. Officers, please come up to the house. This is going to take a few minutes to explain properly, and I think you'll want to see some documents before anyone makes any decisions they might regret later. Officer Miller nodded and gestured for his partner to follow, while Francine hurried to catch up, clearly not wanting to be left out of whatever conversation was about to happen. In my living room, Francine unloaded her evidence like she was prosecuting a felony, painting me as some kind of dangerous squatter, who was destroying property values and terrorizing the entire neighborhood with my reckless disregard for community standards. She had everything organized and ready, the whole arsenal of evidence she'd been building up for weeks. This man has repeatedly ignored lawful orders from the legally constituted homeowners association, she declared, waving her arms dramatically, like she was arguing a case before the Supreme Court. He's turned his property into an eyesore, he's violated numerous community regulations, and he's created a hostile environment for law-abiding residents who just want to live in peace. I had to grip my chair arms to keep from laughing, or strangling her. One wrong word here, one moment of losing my temper, and I could destroy everything I'd worked toward over the past week. Officer Miller was taking notes. His partner was examining Francine's photographs, and I could see them both trying to figure out exactly what law I was supposed to have broken. Disturbing the peace by fishing illegal occupation of property I'd owned for decades. The whole situation was so absurd that I almost felt sorry for the cops who had to waste their morning dealing with it. When she finally ran out of steam and sat down looking smugly satisfied with her presentation, I calmly pulled out 2 file folders I'd prepared the night before. Officers, you've heard one side of this story. Let me show you the other side, and then you can decide for yourselves what's really going on here. I opened the first folder, which contained a thick stack of documents dating back to 1965. Original property deeds, survey maps, tax records, even some old photographs of my father building the dock with his own hands. This dock existed before this neighborhood had roads. I explained, spreading the documents out on my coffee table where everyone could see them clearly. It has absolutely nothing to do with the HOA, and it never has. These documents show the ownership history and the fact that this dock was built decades before the HOA even existed. His posture shifted. He leaned in, scanning the pages with new interest. His partner leaned over to get a better view, and I could see both of them starting to understand that they'd been called out on a wild goose chase. Then I opened the second thinner folder, and this is where things got really interesting. And this, gentleman, is the HOA's land lease agreement with the county. Section 3C specifically states that when an HOA violates the terms of community trust through harassment or abuse of power, residents can petition for emergency fee adjustments. I handed Officer Miller a copy of the relevant pages with the key sections highlighted in yellow. I filed such a petition with the county clerk at 11:40. 7 p.m. last night, exactly 13 minutes after you officers knocked on my door. Francine's face went from smug to pale faster than I thought it was physically possible. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, but her voice had lost all its earlier confidence and authority. She looked like someone who just realized they'd been playing poker with a card sharp and were about to lose their entire stake. What petition? What fee adjustment? Officer Miller's phone chose that exact moment to buzz with an incoming message. And when he read it, his expression changed completely. "Mrs. Vaughn," he said slowly, looking up from his phone, "I'm getting an urgent notification from county administration about your organization's lease fees." Francine grabbed for his phone like she could somehow delete the message if she read it fast enough, but Officer Miller politely pulled it back out of her reach. "It says here that there's been an emergency adjustment to your annual land lease effective immediately. Something about a 700% increase due to community trust violations." That's when I dropped the real bombshell. I'm talking about the petition I filed to increase the HOA's annual land lease fees from $12,000 to $4,000 effective immediately. Silence hit like a slammed door. Even Francine's breath seemed to pause. Officer Miller was staring at me like I'd just admitted to being a secret agent, and his partner was frantically flipping through the legal documents, trying to figure out if what I was saying was actually possible. "Now, I want to be very clear about something," I continued, looking directly at Francine. "This isn't revenge. It's accountability, the kind the HOA forgot. I did it because it's the legal remedy available to residents when their HOA overreaches its authority and engages in harassment campaigns. The county takes abuse of community trust very seriously, and they've provided specific mechanisms for residents to protect themselves when their HOA starts acting like a dictatorship instead of a community service organization." Officer Miller closed his notebook and stood up, clearly ready to end his involvement in this increasingly bizarre situation. "Well, Mr. Clark, it appears that you're on your own property. You have documentation proving your legal right to be here, and any disputes about HOA fees and community management are civil matters that need to be resolved between you and the county administration. He looked at Francine with the kind of expression cops reserve for people who waste their time with frivolous complaints. Ma'am, I'd suggest you contact your legal counsel and work this out through proper channels instead of calling law enforcement about civil disputes. As the police cars pulled away and I watched Francine's face crumble and reel, time her earlier confidence completely shattered, I realized I'd just fired the first shot in what was about to become an all-out war. But looking at her expression of shocked defeat, I couldn't help but wonder, did I have enough ammunition to survive what was coming next? Because something told me that a woman who'd go to the trouble of faking environmental emergencies and cutting off utilities wasn't going to just accept defeat gracefully and walk away. The question was, how far would she be willing to go to get her revenge? Francine refused to accept defeat. And honestly, I should have seen that coming from a mile away. A woman who would spend weeks fabricating complaints and staging fake environmental emergencies wasn't going to just pack up her wounded pride and go quietly into the night. For the next week, she practically lived at the HOA office, holding emergency meetings, making frantic phone calls, and apparently hiring some expensive legal counsel, who immediately sent me a threatening letter. Her lawyer fired off every legal scare tactic in the book, dressed up in elegant formatting. I read that threatening letter over breakfast and just shook my head. Harassment, extortion, abuse of process, malicious interference with business operations, every scary legal term the lawyer could think of, all designed to make me wet my pants and beg for mercy. But here's the thing about working in property law for 20 years. You learn to see past the intimidation tactics and focus on the actual substance underneath. And this letter had about as much legal substance as a chocolate teapot. Ladies throwing good money after bad, I muttered to myself, as I tossed the letter into my kitchen drawer with all the other empty threats I'd received over the years. But then the text messages started coming from neighbors, and that's when I began to realize that Francine's counterattack might be more effective than I had anticipated. Rumors flew that I was bankrupting the neighborhood, staging a coup. Message after message, all from people I'd considered friends, all suddenly treating me like I was the problem instead of the victim. Each text hit harder than the last, until even I started to wonder if I'd gone too far. For the first time since this whole nightmare started, I started doubting myself and wondering if maybe I'd gone too far with the 700% fee increase. Maybe I was being vindictive instead of just protecting my rights. Maybe a smaller increase would have made my point without threatening the whole community's budget. Maybe I should have just quietly moved away like Francine wanted and avoided dragging everyone else into this mess. These doubts kept me awake at night, staring at the ceiling and wondering if I was fighting for justice or just being a stubborn old man who couldn't admit when it was time to compromise. The isolation was getting to me in ways I hadn't expected, and I started to understand why so many people just give in to bullies rather than fight back. Even one of the guys who had once offered to help fix my dock now looked through me in the grocery aisle. Then Francine organized a packed community meeting at the clubhouse, and I knew this was going to be my make-up or break moment. I could either face the music and defend my actions, or I could skip the meeting and let Francine control the narrative completely. I chose to go even though walking into that room felt like walking into a lion's den. Nearly 100 people were crammed into folding chairs, and the mood was definitely not friendly. Conversations stopped when I walked in, people turned to stare, and more than a few of them looked like they wanted to personally escort me out of the building. She took the podium like a desperate politician, with one last shot complete with charts and graphs showing how my frivolous fee increase would bankrupt their budget and force them to close the pool, cancel the holiday party, maybe even dissolve the HOA entirely. She painted a picture of community devastation that would have been impressive if it hadn't been so completely over the top. According to her presentation, I was single, handedly destroying the American dream of suburban homeownership one dock board at a time. This man, she declared, pointing at me dramatically, is holding our entire community hostage over his personal vendetta against legitimate authority. He's exploiting legal loopholes for personal revenge, using technicalities to punish innocent families who just want to live in a safe, well-maintained neighborhood. The crowd murmured agreement, and I could feel the hostility in the room, growing thicker by the minute. Several people were actually nodding along, with her presentation apparently convinced that I was some kind of neighborhood terrorist who needed to be stopped at all costs. I sat in the back corner holding my folder of evidence and seriously considering just walking out. I could drive home, pack my truck, and be fishing in Montana by next weekend, leaving all this drama behind forever. Nobody was forcing me to stay and fight. I could just take the path of least resistance and start over somewhere else where nobody knew my name or cared about my family history. But then I thought about my dad, about every bully who'd ever counted on good people backing down when things got uncomfortable, and I knew I couldn't just walk away. When Francine finally ran out of steam and asked if anyone had questions or comments, the room went dead silent. You could have heard a mouse sneeze in the back row. That's when I stood up, and every head in the room turned to look at me like I was about to confess to a crime. "Evening, everyone," I said, walking slowly toward the front of the room. "Mrs. Vaughn asked me to explain myself, so here I am. And I think after you hear what I have to say, you'll understand that this situation is a lot more complicated than she's made it sound." I opened my folder and pulled out the same documents I'd shown the police officers, spreading them across the table where everyone could see them clearly. She's right about one thing. I did request a fee increase, but what she hasn't mentioned is why that increase was legally justified under Section 3C of your lease agreement. I explained the harassment campaign, the fake environmental emergency, the utility shutoffs, all the dirty tricks Francine had used to try to force me off my own property. This isn't revenge, folks. This is the county's built in safeguard against exactly what happened to me. Then I dropped the bomb that I'd been saving for exactly this moment. I didn't come here to defend my honor. I came to expose the truth. And if you're worried about the HO, dissolving because of these increased fees, I've prepared a backup plan that I think you'll all find very interesting. I pulled out another set of documents that I'd spent the afternoon preparing. We can hold a vote of no confidence in the current board and start fresh with people who actually understand their legal limitations and won't waste community resources on personal vendettas. The room erupted in surprised murmurs, and for the first time all evening, some of those murmurs sounded supportive instead of hostile. One clap echoed in the room, then two. By the fifth, the room broke into full, blown applause that drowned Francine's name. People were standing up, nodding agreement, even shouting out suggestions for new board members who might actually serve the community instead of their own egos. But as I looked across the crowded room at Francine's face, I saw an expression of pure hatred that made my blood run cold. This wasn't over. Not even close. The question was, how far would she go to destroy me now that I'd humiliated her in front of the entire community? After that community meeting, everything changed faster than I could have imagined possible. It was like someone had pulled a thread on a sweater, and the whole thing started unraveling at once. People who had been silent for years suddenly found their voices and started asking questions, digging through HOA records they'd never bothered to read, before demanding explanations for decisions that had never made sense in the first place. Meeting minutes were leaked backyards, buzzed with whispered accusations, and HOA meetings turned into verbal minefields. Francine's desperate attempts to control the narrative just made her look more guilty and unhinged with every passing day. She ranted online at 2 a.m. while pacing behind her closed blinds like a ghost who didn't know she'd lost. She was sending aggressive emails to anyone who would listen, even cornering people at the grocery store to complain about me and my illegal manipulation of county regulations. The more desperate she got, the more people started wondering what she was really trying to hide. I mean, if she was so confident in her position and so sure that I was the problem, why was she acting like someone with a guilty conscience who needed to convince everyone else of her innocence? That's when I got the phone call that changed everything. Stuart Morrison, a retired accountant who'd served on the HOA board for 15 years and had always seemed like one of the more reasonable members, asked to meet me privately at my house. Stuart was the kind of guy who kept meticulous records, dotted every I and crossed every T, the type of person you'd want, handling your taxes or managing your retirement account. So when Stuart appeared unannounced, clutching boxes and shaking with rage, a woman at war with her own regrets, I knew something big was about to happen. "Clark," he said, sliding the envelope across my table, with hands that were actually shaking. "I can't stay silent anymore. What Francine's been doing, it's not just about you and your doc. It's been going on for years, and I've been too much of a coward to speak up, because I didn't want to deal with the drama and the conflict." Inside that envelope were photocopies of receipts, bank statements, and credit card bills that made my jaw drop. Francine had been using HOA funds like her personal piggy bank for longer than anyone had imagined. Among the receipts, a kitchen remodel labeled emergency repairs and enough boutique charges to open her own store. Page after page of fraudulent expenses, all carefully disguised as legitimate community business, all adding up to more money than most people make in a year. Looking at those receipts spread across my kitchen table, no fury left. Just a bitter sense of inevitability, like watching a dam break you warned about for years. She really thought no one would ever check, didn't she? I asked Stuart, who was staring at the evidence like he still couldn't believe what he'd been helping to cover up through his silence. I should have said something years ago, he admitted. But she was so intimidating, so sure of herself, and I kept thinking maybe there were explanations I didn't understand. I kept giving her the benefit of the doubt until it became impossible to ignore what was really happening. I spent the next 2 days putting together a comprehensive report that documented everything. Not just the financial violations, but timeline evidence showing how Francine had escalated against me, specifically after I'd questioned her authority. The pattern was clear once you laid it all out chronologically. Every time someone challenged her decisions or asked uncomfortable questions, they became targets for harassment and intimidation. I wasn't her first victim, just the first one who'd fought back effectively and refused to be driven away. I made copies of everything and compiled it into packages that I sent to every resident in the community, along with copies to the local newspaper and the county prosecutor's office. No dramatic confrontations, no angry accusations, just the facts laid out clearly and let people draw their own conclusions. Sometimes the truth is more powerful than any argument you could make, and I figured the evidence would speak for itself better than any speech I could give. The next morning looked like something out of a movie. Cars were lined up outside the HOA office, angry residents demanding answers, some of them holding copies of my report and asking pointed questions about specific receipts and expenses. Francine had barricaded herself inside the office, but you could see her silhouette pacing frantically behind the blinds like a caged animal. Every few minutes, someone would pound on the door demanding to speak with her, but she wasn't opening that door for anyone. By noon, the board had called an emergency meeting. By evening, they'd taken a vote that surprised absolutely no one who'd been paying attention. The vote was unanimous, 47-2, with Francine and one loyal supporter being the only dissenting voices. Francine Vaughn was officially removed from office, effective immediately stripped of all authority, and banned from representing the HOA in any capacity. She loaded the box into her car, under a dozen watching eyes, her power now reduced to a rattling stapler and crumpled flyers. But as I watched her load that box into her car and drive away, I had this strange feeling that the story wasn't over yet. Something about the way she looked at me through her windshield, not defeated, not apologetic, just cold and calculating, like she was already planning her next move. I'd won this battle, but somehow I didn't think Francine Vaughn was the type of person who'd just accept defeat and disappear quietly into the night. The question was, what could she possibly do now that she'd lost all her official power and most of the community had turned against her? The no confidence vote wasn't even close. Francine was out by a margin of 47-2, and honestly, I think those two supporters were probably just voting out of habit rather than conviction. She cleaned out her office that same evening, carrying a single cardboard box to her car, while half the neighborhood watched from their windows and front porches. No longer the imperious HO. A queen who had made everyone's life miserable with her petty power trips, just a defeated woman who'd finally discovered that actions have consequences. The new board immediately offered me a position as advisor, but I declined politely. Thanks, but I just want to fish in peace. I told them, and I meant it. I did give them some free advice about transparency, actually reading their own contracts before making threats and treating residents like human beings instead of subjects in their little kingdom. But mostly I was just relieved to get back to my quiet routine of morning coffee, afternoon fishing, and evening reading, without worrying about what crazy scheme Francine might cook up next. The quiet that followed felt too perfect, the kind of silence predators love before they strike again. My dock was officially recognized as private property, complete with a formal apology from the new HOA leadership. They read it aloud on my dock, the same place Francine once tried to erase from history. Francine had completely disappeared from the neighborhood. No more drive-bys, no more threatening letters, no more middle of the night harassment. I went back to my peaceful routine and actually started to believe that the nightmare was finally over. Looking back, I should have known better, than to think someone like Francine would just accept defeat and move on with her life. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning while I was enjoying my coffee and watching the sunrise paint the lake gold. Russell barely let me say hello. Turn on the news, now it's poetic justice in 1080p. I grabbed the remote and switched to the morning news broadcast, expecting maybe some follow-up story about HOA reform or community governance. What I saw instead made me nearly drop my coffee mug on the kitchen floor. Francine's mugshot flashed across the screen, all smeared mascara and deflated pride. The charges were serious. Embezzlement of community funds, abuse of public trust, filing false police reports, and intimidation of residents. But here's the part that really shocked me. According to the news report, the county prosecutor had been building a case against her for months based on complaints from other neighborhoods where she'd previously served on HOA boards. She's been doing this for years, Russell explained, when I called him back, his voice full of vindication and amazement. You weren't her first victim, Clark, just the first one who fought back effectively and refused to be intimidated into silence. Apparently, Francine had a pattern of joining HOA boards, consolidating power, then using her position to settle personal grudges and fund her lifestyle. 3 different communities had filed complaints over the past 5 years, but none of them had the kind of documentation and evidence that I'd been able to provide. But the real surprise was still coming, and it was bigger than anything I could have imagined. The new HOA board, trying to demonstrate their commitment to transparency and fiscal responsibility, decided to honor the 700% fee increase I'd legally requested. They figured it would show the community that they were serious about accountability and wouldn't just sweep past violations under the rug like nothing had happened. What they didn't anticipate was how the math would work out once you factored in all the other financial damage Francine had caused. With their budget already devastated by Francine's embezzlement and the massive legal fees from defending against her various violations and harassment campaigns, the increased lease payments made continued operation financially impossible. Even with the most optimistic projections and the most aggressive cost, cutting measures, they simply couldn't generate enough revenue to cover their obligations. Faced with insolvency and scandal, the HOA voted itself out of existence, unanimous, ashes to ashes. The clubhouse where rules were weaponized became a picnic shelter. The pool once gated echoed with laughter again. But instead of selling the properties to developers or letting them fall into disrepair, they did something amazing. They converted everything into a public park, open to everyone in the surrounding communities, maintained by county funds, and operated as a genuine public service rather than an exclusive private club. No more rules about grass height or approved dog breeds. No more power, hungry presidents making arbitrary decisions about dock aesthetics or community standards. No more harassment campaigns against residents who dared to question authority or think for themselves. Just a beautiful lakeside community where people could actually enjoy their lives without worrying about some petty dictator with a clipboard and a badge making their existence miserable over imaginary violations. I'm still here by my dock every morning, watching the sunrise and casting my line into the same waters where my father taught me to fish 60 years ago. The park gets busy on weekends now, families having picnics where the clubhouse used to be, kids learning to swim in the pool that's now free for everyone, people walking their dogs without worrying about breed restrictions or leash length regulations. Sometimes I see former neighbors who were initially angry at me for destroying their community. Most of them wave now, understanding that what I did actually benefited everyone in the long run. The local newspaper ran a feature story about HOA overreach and community empowerment that attracted national attention. Lawyers started calling it the Clark Doctrine, using an organization's own rules and legal framework against them when they exceed their authority and abuse their power. I've gotten emails from people across the country facing similar situations, asking for advice about dealing with their own versions of Francine Vaughn. My answer is always the same. Read the fine print, know your rights, document everything, and don't let bullies count on you backing down when things get uncomfortable. One letter came from a widow in Texas whose HOA was trying to force her to remove her late husband's memorial garden. Another from a veteran in Oregon facing harassment over his service dog. Each story reminded me that bullies like Francine exist everywhere, wielding clipboards like weapons and using fear to control decent people who just want to live in peace. Francine got 18 months in county jail, and had to pay full restitution to all the communities she'd defrauded over the years. More importantly, the state legislature changed its laws to require better oversight of HOA finances, clearer appeals processes for residents, and stronger penalties for board members who abuse their positions. Sometimes it takes one really egregious case to shine a light on problems that have been hiding in the shadows for years, and apparently my little dock dispute was exactly the kind of catalyst that lawmakers needed to take action. Turns out, a dock isn't just wood and bolts, it's memory, it's defiance, it's enough to topple a kingdom built on fear. The best revenge isn't revenge at all, it's just being smarter and more patient than the people trying to hurt you. I didn't set out to destroy an HOA or send anyone to jail. I just wanted to keep my dock and live in peace. But sometimes when you stand up to one bully, you end up protecting everyone else they might have hurt next. As I sit here telling you this story, watching the ducks paddle peacefully across the lake, I can't help but wonder, if you found yourself in my shoes with bullies trying to steal what's rightfully yours, would you have the patience to play the long game and fight back smart instead of fighting back angry? Because I'm betting there are more Francines out there than any of us would like to admit. And they're all counting on good people staying quiet and hoping someone else will solve the problem. Sometimes the only way evil wins is when good people decide it's easier to just move away than stand and fight. My dock stands as proof that sometimes one person's refusal to back down can change everything. Every morning, when I cast my line into these waters, I think about all the people who might be facing their own Francine right now, wondering if they should fight or flee. I hope they choose to fight. I hope they remember that bullies only win when we let them. And maybe that's the real lesson here. Some things are worth standing your ground for, even if it's just a worn, out dock and a handful of memories. Not out of pride, not out of spite, but because giving up teaches the wrong people all the wrong things. If you're still here, I'd love to know what you think ever had to take a stand, when it would have been easier to walk away. Drop your story in the comments. And hey, if this one hit home and you want to help keep these stories going, there's a little thanks button down below. Thanks for hanging out. Catch you in the next one.
QA Stories signing off for now, but the drama, it never sleeps. Tap that bell if you're ready for round 2.